Vermintide 2 has quite a few subclasses to pick from, but probably none are as difficult to properly utilize as the Slayer. The Slayer is a chaotic tornado of death, but chances are the death that most Slayers you'll be paired up with are spreading is their own. So if you want to do a little bit more than simply upholding the latter part of your Slayer oath, here's a full guide and build for the Slayer that will get you through every difficulty. Everything you'll see here was played on the Legend difficulty, but most of it will scale down just fine, and here and there I'll point to some specific changes you'll find are useful for the lower difficulties as well. The Slayer is a class that excels at dealing damage rapidly, and your particular set of weaponry will make you excellent at dealing with armor targets, bosses, and other similar elites. The main downside of the Slayer is a lack of range weaponry, which, especially on the Legend difficulty, will be a real hurdle to get over. Additionally, until you've picked specific talent upgrades, the Slayer lacks default defenses as well, which results in a class that absolutely demands a lot of proper positioning and care for your health, far more so than other classes in Vermintide 2. But if all of that doesn't dissuade you from playing this running, jumping ball of axes, then here's how to play him optimally. Let's start off with some of the basics, and then we'll get down to the real business of building our Slayer. By default, the Slayer has two passives, both oriented at dealing damage, increased attack speed, and a stacking damage buff which stacks up to 3 times. His activated career ability is called Leap, which is rather self-explanatory. The Slayer leaps to a location. Keep in mind that holding down the career ability button allows you to see the indicator, and upon landing staggers all enemies in a small AoE and gains another big increased attack speed bonus. Despite it being a leap with solid maximum range, you'll almost always want to use this directly in front of you. The reason being that, frankly, it's not the most reliable, but most of all, if you get caught out as a Slayer, you're going to die really quickly. So instead, use this point blank in order to give you and your team a breather as you knock most things down while giving yourself a big damage increase. Also important to know is that you can block during leap, and you should almost always be doing this, as chances are you might jump into an opponent in the middle of his attack swing, which can connect before you can react if you aren't blocking during leap. Additionally, you could also charge up a swing mid-air, which can be useful to deal an immediate bit of extra damage, providing you are safe enough to do so. This ability is one of the shorter career abilities in the game with a base cooldown of 40 seconds, meaning the Slayer brings with it quite a competent, consistent stagger and damage output. Of course, because it is a leap, there are going to be scenarios in which you can absolutely support a teammate that just went down or needs help on the other side of the room. Just be sure you are blocking while doing this with enough stamina to push your way back to a safe spot afterwards. Now let's move on to building the Slayer, because this is easily where the best part of the Slayer comes into play. Dual axes. The Slayer, unlike every other class in the game, has access to 2 weapon types at a time, and one of these should be, without a doubt, his unique dual axe weapon type. The dual axes synergize perfectly with this stacking damage buff, as every charge strike counts as 2 attacks, and as such does have a little bit of a different hitbox per axe, which is something to keep in mind. And the regular light attacks on this weapon type are some of the fastest in the game. Additionally, they are amazing versus armor targets and can break through shielded opponents relatively fast, especially if you use the push attack, which generally changes your kill time of a shielded opponent from 5 hits to 3 at the cost of stamina. In short, they are some of the best single target weapons in the game and have no real downside to them except their lack of area damage and low stamina. But despite it having low stamina, it does have the highest dodge range of any of Bardin's weapons. Now that should clue you in as to what type of weapon we're looking for in our second melee weapon, but let's go over the options real quick, as you'll find there aren't that many viable options for the higher difficulties. One-handed axes are irrelevant, as the dual axes do everything they do, but better. The two-handed axe and the pickaxe both suffer from the same problem, being relatively slow, and despite being AoE weapons, their actual AoE range isn't enough for strong horde control on the higher difficulties, and yet again dual axes are already our best option for single target and armor targets. So they are out as well, which leaves us with one-handed hammers and the two-handed hammers. Both of these weapons are tanking weapons, and the one-handed hammer has a lot of stamina, which is excellent for reviving allies or potentially tanking bosses. In addition, it has the highest stagger, allowing you to stunlock even berserkers with no problem, but it suffers from one major downside, and that is poor horde control. The two-handed hammer, on the other hand, is one of the best horde crowd control weapons in the game. The charged up attacks have the most range of any melee weapon Bardin can use, and do a lot of stagger, allowing you to essentially manage an entire horde by bobbing and weaving with charged attacks. Charge swings from a two-handed hammer also do a slight forward dash, granting even more reach. Sadly, it doesn't have the same stamina as the one-handed hammer does, which means it's worse at helping allies up on their feet, but nevertheless is far and beyond the best second weapon type you can have as a Slayer. Now on the lower difficulties, you don't necessarily need a dedicated horde crowd control weapon. The dual axes do enough damage and are fast enough to cut through hordes, slave rats especially, but you'll find this becomes a real issue on champion until your hero power is high enough and remains a real issue on legend, meaning I definitely argue that the two-handed hammer is mandatory to take with you on the higher difficulties. On the lower difficulties, or champion, if your hero power is more or less higher than 400, the one-handed hammer is a really good alternative option. Because again, this gives you more boss tanking potential and allows you to more easily revive allies, but as you can see in the footage here as well, on legend the only way that is going to work is if you have enough room to maneuver. And hordes become a real threat on legend, meaning that two-handed hammer crowd control becomes essential for survival. Not to mention, blocking isn't a guaranteed form of defense either, as some bosses do damage that go past blocking or break block entirely. In the end, the best form of defense is staggering enemies and dodging, and dual axes are the best weapon for dodging, whereas two-handed hammers are the best weapon for staggering hordes. Moving on from weapons to talent choices. At level 5 you want to pick Stoutfellow, which is a solid increase in survivability. Keep in mind that the Slayer, unlike the Ironbreaker for instance, isn't remotely front-loaded and needs all the survival he can get. Your other options in this tier are not worth picking. Hack and Slash is a very small increase, and frankly all of Barden's weapons don't have a high enough base crit for this to be worth focusing on. And See It Coming is too small of a difference yet again. And again, dual axes already have stellar dodging potential, so increasing it is rather irrelevant. At level 10 you want to pick Oblivious to Pain, which is one of the best survivability increases you can get. What this means is that damage between 15 to 30 is always reduced to 15, whereas damage above 30 is halved. This won't do anything against regular horde enemies, but it will give you a lot of extra breathing room if you get hit by an elite or boss by surprise. The other alternatives are yet again not worth considering. Stunty Savior is too little too late for the Slayer once it activates, and Crippling Wounds yet again doesn't do enough because of your low baseline crit. Even with Hack and Slash, you are looking at about 2 crits every 20 seconds by default, which obviously isn't a lot, and yet again, I'll reiterate that damage isn't the Slayer's problem to begin with. At level 15, you have 2 choices, but one that is guaranteed to be better at higher levels, which is Adrenaline Surge. Adrenaline Surge is the best talent you can get because it pairs very well with your level 25 talents, and more leaps means more staggering means faster kill potential, which essentially gives you survivability, damage, and the rare case of support utility. With Adrenaline Surge and a full buff upkeep, you are looking at about 1/4 of your regular leap cooldown, a mere 10 seconds or so cooldown on leap. The only other alternative that I would recommend at levels below 20 is Moving Target. Moving Target is far too little of a difference to be worth it on Legend, but until you are 20, this is a good way to keep staying alive a little bit longer. At level 20, your only option is Grudgeborn, as the other options are simply not remotely as useful. This is probably the best survivability talent in the game, and you'll find that practically everyone will get their respective temp HP on kill talent at 20 for a very good reason. Once you get to level 20 and pick up Grudgeborn, essentially the entire game changes, up until Legend, and everything below Legend will start to feel significantly easier. On Legend, however, the temp HP is not enough for you to go on an all-out rampage, and even though it's still really good, it does demand a defensive playstyle. Then we get to level 25, where you're presented with 2 solid choices, though one that I think is definitely better for Legend, which is Crunch. With Crunch, you are increasing the stagger of your leap, and as you'll be leaping a lot point blank, you'll be staggering a lot of crowds. It's not a tremendous upgrade from the default stagger, but it's enough for you to knock down rod helms for instance, whereas leap alone wouldn't by default. Because on Legend, your moving room is significantly limited due to the threatening hordes, Crunch quickly becomes your safest level 25 talent that gives you just a few extra seconds of breathing room when you're fighting enemies. Below Legend, I would likely go with No Escape instead, which gives you a nice 25% speed increase that allows you to play more aggressively, which certainly on Recruit and Veteran is more rewarding and helpful for your team to go with. For Champion, it depends highly on how high your hero power is yet again. Once you're above 400, you'll find Champion is enough for you to get more out of an aggressive playstyle, but that immediately changes once you hit Legend. Finally, the reason Unstoppable is not worth it is simply because it doesn't do enough and is entirely irrelevant for dual axes. It does pair decently with two-handed hammers if you are in a tight spot, but ultimately it is not enough of an upgrade to consider. Once you've got all that, you can consider optimizing your items by re-rolling for the correct properties and traits, and they are as followed. For dual axes, your trade options aren't amazing, but you'll likely get the most out of Swift Slaying, which increases your attack speed further when you do get a critical hit, or potentially Heroic Intervention, which gives you a damage shield when you save an ally from a Gutter Runner, Hook Rat, or Leech. The problem of course being that the Slayer isn't the best at killing specials, and chances are your allies with a ranged weapon will get there first. Property-wise, you are looking for increased attack speed, increased base stamina, or simply power versus Skaven or Chaos. For the two-handed hammer, I'd suggest Swift Slaying for your trait, which gives you a little bit more stopping power versus hordes, and as for the properties, I'd go with increased base stamina so you can revive allies more easily, or power versus Skaven or Chaos. With the necklace, you'll want to get anything besides Natural Bond as your trait because this locks out self-healing and especially in quick play becomes too unreliable, whereas for properties, you are looking at yet again base stamina, health, or damage reduction. The base stamina you are looking for in total comes down to about 5 stamina shields max because going over this number is likely irrelevant. For charms, any trait will do, and property-wise you want increased attack speed or power versus Skaven or Chaos. And finally, with the trinket, any trait will do, and most important of all is getting curse resistance as a property. This is by far the best survivability upgrade you can get from a property, providing you of course do take grimoires with you, but if you're planning to take at least one grimoire, definitely get curse resistance. And with that, we're done building our Slayer. Definitely a very fun class to play, albeit not necessarily on the top tier list for Legends. You can certainly make it work though. The lack of ranged weapon is a big hurdle, and somewhere down the line I'd hope to see more options for the Slayer to build up temporary HP faster to offset this dangerous playstyle, but nevertheless, if you follow this guide, you will be absolutely legend ready. Always keep in mind your positioning, it's incredibly important for a Slayer. Go for headshots, as obvious as it may seem, your kill time will speed up dramatically, and finally remember to use your leap very conservatively if you want to live. Thanks for watching, my name has been Haas, and happy slaying.